A cynical billionaire fakes a nap to trap his maid's son in a high-stakes game of greed. But what the scrawny 7-year-old does instead shatters the old man's bitterness and proves that the richest hearts often have the emptiest pockets. Mr. Harrington has spent a lifetime building a fortune, but losing his faith in humanity. After years of betrayal by partners and staff, he lives by a single dark conviction. If you give a person a chance to take something, they will. On a cold, rainy afternoon, he sets his final trap, leaving $5,000 spilling out of an envelope and pretending to drift into a deep sleep. But what happens next doesn't reveal a thief. It reveals a child's selfless sacrifice that forces a lonely billionaire to realize he is the one who is truly poor. The rain drummed against the towering mahogany doors of the Harrington estate, a relentless sound that mirrored the pounding in Chi's chest. As she stood in the grand foyer, her hands gripped Ifanyi's shoulders so tightly that her knuckles turned ash gray. The air inside the mansion was heavy with the scent of expensive beeswax and old history, a stark contrast to the damp, salt-tinged air of the cramped apartment they were one late payment away from losing. "Listen to me, Ifanyi," Chi whispered, her voice dropping to a jagged, desperate low that made the 7-year-old look up with wide, searching eyes. "You must be silent as a mouse. Do you hear me? Not a peep, not a shuffle." Ifanyi nodded, his small frame looking even more fragile beneath a thin, faded windbreaker that had seen too many winters. He reached up to adjust the oversized white gloves Chi had insisted he wear. She had told him they were magic working gloves, but in reality they were her only shield against the billionaire's legendary temper, a way to ensure her son's curious fingers didn't leave a single smudge on the priceless artifacts that lined the hallways. "If Mr. Harrington even knows you are here, we are finished," Chi continued, her gaze darting toward the shadows of the hallway. "We won't have a roof over our heads tonight if he wakes up and finds a child in his library. This isn't a playground, Ifanyi. This is our last chance." Ifanyi swallowed hard, his throat moving convulsively. He saw the dark circles carved deep under his mother's eyes, the physical map of her exhaustion and the grief of losing his father 2 years ago. He knew that when she spoke of the street, she wasn't telling a ghost story. She was describing a monster that was sitting on their very doorstep. "I'll be good, Mommy," he breathed, the words barely a ripple in the quiet air. "I promise." Chi took a ragged breath and smoothed his messy hair one last time, her heart aching at the sight of his worn-out shoes with holes at the toes. She led him toward the heavy oak doors of the library, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She pointed toward a small, shadowed corner near a towering bookshelf, tucked away on a plush rug. "Sit there," she commanded softly. "Do not move, do not touch anything." She watched him settle into a small ball, his knees pulled to his chest, looking like a discarded toy in a room built for giants. Satisfied that he was as invisible as he could be, Chi turned her gaze toward the center of the room. There, slumped in a burgundy velvet armchair, was the man who held their lives in his calloused, wealthy hands, Mr. Harrington. To Ifanyi, the old man looked like a mountain of stone. Harrington's silver hair caught the flickering light of the fireplace, and his face, even in the supposed softness of sleep, was set in a stern, unforgiving scowl. Next to his hand, an envelope sat on the mahogany table, its contents, crisp green bills, spilling out like a taunt. Chi glanced at the money, then at her son, and felt a shiver of pure, unadulterated terror. She whispered one final silent prayer before backing out of the room to begin her chores, leaving Ifanyi alone with the sleeping billionaire and the ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown to their ruin. The silence in the library was thick. It felt like it had its own weight, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the man in the chair and the mocking tick-tock of the grandfather clock. Ifanyi sat perfectly still in his corner, his small heart drumming a frantic beat against his ribs. He watched his mother's shadow vanish under the crack of the door, leaving him alone in a room that felt like a cathedral built for a god who didn't like children. His eyes, wide and dark, drifted from the towering shelves of leather-bound books to the man in the center of the room. Mr. Harrington looked like a statue carved from ice. To a 7-year-old, the billionaire wasn't just a boss, he was the master of their fate, a giant who could end their world with a single word. Ifanyi looked down at his hands. The oversized white gloves felt clumsy and heavy, the fabric bunching at his wrists. He remembered his mother's frantic eyes. "Don't touch anything." He squeezed his fingers together, feeling the soft cotton, imagining it as a shield that kept their poverty from staining the shimmering surfaces of this house. Then he saw it. On the mahogany table, right next to the billionaire's limp, pale hand, sat the envelope. It was bulging, and as the firelight flickered, Ifanyi saw the green edges of more money than he knew existed in the world. But the envelope was perched precariously on the very edge of the polished wood. With every heavy breath the old man took, the slight vibration of the floor seemed to nudge the paper closer to the abyss. Ifanyi froze. If that money fell, the sound would be like a thunderclap in the silence. Mr. Harrington would wake up. He would see Ifanyi. He would see a child where there should be none, and then his mother would lose her job. The image of their few belongings piled on a wet sidewalk flashed through his mind. The monster his mother had described was waking up, and it was the sound of falling paper that would call it. Slowly, with the agonizing caution of a prey animal moving through high grass, Ifanyi rose from his corner. His knees popped, a sound that felt like a gunshot in the silence. He held his breath until his lungs burned. He took one step, then another, his worn-out shoes making no sound on the plush Persian rug. He reached the edge of the table. Up close, the money looked like a living thing, ready to leap. Beneath his eyelids, Arthur Harrington's pupils tracked the boy's movement, a predatory surveillance hidden behind a mask of sleep. The billionaire felt a surge of cold triumph. Here it comes. The little rat is going for the bait. Even the children are the same. Ifanyi reached out. The oversized white gloves looked enormous as they hovered over the stack of $100 bills. His hands trembled. He wasn't looking at the numbers on the bills or imagining what they could buy. The shoes without holes, the hot meals, the rest his mother so desperately needed. He was looking at the way the envelope was tilted. With a delicacy that would have put a diamond cutter to shame, Ifanyi didn't grab the cash. Instead, he used two gloved fingers to gently, silently nudge the envelope back toward the center of the table. He pushed it inch by inch until it was safely away from the edge, secured against the heavy base of the brass lamp. He then took a small leather-bound coaster and placed it partially over the top of the envelope, a paperweight to ensure the falling money wouldn't move again. He let out a long, shaky breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. The threat was gone, the money was safe, his mother's job was safe, and the giant was still asleep. He looked at Mr. Harrington's face, noticing for the first time how the old man shivered slightly in the draft from the window. Ifanyi didn't see a billionaire or a judge. He saw someone who looked lonely, someone who looked cold. As the boy began to back away, returning to his shadow, Arthur Harrington felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in his chest. The test had been designed for a thief, but the boy had acted like a guardian. For the first time in decades, the billionaire's calculations had returned an error. He remained still, his eyes closed, but the wall of his cynicism had just suffered its first microscopic crack. The draft from the library's tall windows seemed to grow sharper as the storm outside intensified, sending a ghostly chill through the vast, high-ceilinged room. Ifanyi, still standing by the mahogany table where he had just secured the precarious envelope, watched the old man's frail chest rise and fall. Even with the fire crackling in the hearth, the billionaire looked remarkably small against the deep burgundy velvet of his chair. As Ifanyi turned to slip back into his corner, a sudden violent shudder racked Mr. Harrington. The old man didn't wake, but his hands, veined like the marble floors in the foyer, trembled, and his brow furrowed as if even in sleep he was fighting a losing battle against the cold. To the world, this man was a fortress of power, but to the boy standing inches away, he looked exactly like the elderly neighbors in their apartment block who huddled over space heaters that barely worked. Ifanyi hesitated, his oversized white gloves twisting together. He remembered his mother's frantic loop in his mind. Do not touch him, do not let him see you. To approach again was risking everything.
If Mr. Harrington woke now and saw the boy hovering over him, there would be no way to explain the intrusion. The monster would awaken, the job would be lost, and the street would wait for them. But then another shudder passed through the old man. Ifanyi looked down at his own windbreaker. It was a thin, faded thing, nylon and salt-stained, but it held the warmth of his own body. In his young mind, the world was divided into simple truths, and the simplest one of all was that being cold was a miserable, lonely thing. It didn't matter that this man owned the mountain they stood on. If he was shivering, he was hurting. "Cold is cold," Ifanyi whispered, the sound so faint it swallowed the ticking clock. With a slow, deliberate motion, Ifanyi unzipped his jacket. The metal teeth of the zipper made a tiny, rhythmic scritch that sounded like a saw in the silent room. He froze, eyes locked on Harrington's face, waiting for the eyes to snap open. The billionaire, watching through the microscopic slits of his...
The heavy silence of the library was suddenly shattered by a sharp, guttural cough that sounded like the crack of a whip. Ifanyi, who had been huddled in the shadows, trying to keep warm in his thin tank top, nearly jumped out of his skin. He watched in frozen horror as the mountain of stones stirred. Mr. Harrington didn't just wake up, he seems to explode into consciousness, his eyes snapping open with a terrifying, predatory clarity. With a swift, violent motion, Harrington swept the faded windbreaker off his lap, letting it fall to the floor as if it were a piece of filth. He sat bolt upright, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unbridled fury. "Who is in here?" Harrington roared, his voice booming off the leather-bound books and high ceilings. Ifanyi stood paralyzed, his oversized white gloves trembling at his sides. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt in his life. Before he could even attempt to speak, the library door flew open. UCHE rushed in, her face drained of all color, her cleaning rag still clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "Sir, Mr. Harrington, I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice thin and shaking. She rushed to Ifanyi's side, shielding him with her body. "He is my son, sir. The sitter didn't show, and the rain was so heavy. I thought if he stayed in the corner, silent—" "Silent!" Harrington spat the word as if it were poison. He stood up, towering over them, the firelight casting long, monstrous shadows behind him. He didn't look like a man who had just been tucked in with a jacket. He looked like a judge about to pass a death sentence. "You bring a stranger into my private sanctuary? You allow a trespasser to hover over me while I sleep?" "He's just a child, sir," UCHE pleaded, her eyes brimming with tears. "He didn't mean any harm." "A child?" Harrington laughed, a cold, hollow sound that chilled the air more than the storm outside. He pointed a long, accusing finger at the mahogany table, specifically at the envelope of cash. "He wasn't just hovering, Sarah. I felt him. I felt his hands near my property. This was no accidental intrusion. This was a calculated move." He stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking menacingly on the hardwood floor. "I know how this works. You send in the boy because his hands are small and his footsteps are light. You think because I'm old I'm senile? You think I wouldn't notice a thief in my own home?" "No, sir, he didn't take anything," UCHE cried, grabbing Ifanyi's hands and holding them up. "Look at his gloves. I told him not to touch a single thing, and he didn't. Please, check the money. Check everything." Harrington didn't look at the money. He kept his piercing gaze locked on Ifanyi, who was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. "Oh, I'll check everything," the billionaire growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous low vibrato. "I'll check the cameras, I'll check the inventory, and then I'll call the police. You haven't just lost your job, woman. You've brought a criminal into my house." The word criminal struck Ifanyi like a physical blow. He looked down at his jacket, lying on the floor, discarded and wrinkled. He wanted to tell the man that he had only wanted to stop the money from falling, that he had only wanted to keep him warm, but the words were trapped in his throat by a wall of sheer terror. Chi fell to her knees, her hands clasped in front of her. "Please, Mr. Harrington, it's a misunderstanding. We have nowhere else to go. If you fire me, if you call the police, we'll be on the streets. Please, have mercy." Harrington looked down at the weeping woman and the trembling boy, his heart seemingly as hard as the diamonds he traded. Mercy is for those who earn trust, and in this house, trust is a currency you've clearly spent. He turned his back on them, walking toward the fireplace, leaving the mother and son in a state of absolute ruin. The monster had not just awakened, it had begun to tear their lives apart. And for Ifeanyi, the oversized gloves that were supposed to protect them now felt like a heavy shroud of failure. Harrington stood by the fireplace, his back turned to the weeping mother and the trembling boy, but his reflection in the darkened window showed a face that remained tight and calculating. He could feel the weight of the silence behind him, broken only by Chi's muffled sobs. He knew they had them cornered, yet the memory of the warm windbreaker being tucked around his knees felt like a brand on his skin. He needed to find the crack in the boy's story. He needed to prove that this kindness was just a clever cover for a deeper, more devious plan. Slowly, Harrington turned around. He didn't look at the money on the table. Instead, his cold gray eyes dropped to the floor where the faded windbreaker lay in a damp heap. He stepped forward, and with the toe of his polished Italian leather shoe, he nudged the wet fabric. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Harrington asked, his voice low and dangerous, like the rumble of distant thunder. Chi looked up, her face streaked with tears. It's just his jacket, sir. It was raining so hard, and he thought you were cold." Harrington let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh that had no joy in it. He gestured toward the deep burgundy velvet of the armchair he had just vacated. "This chair is antique French mahogany. The velvet was custom loomed in Lyon. It costs $200 a yard, and it is older than your family tree. And look at it." He pointed to a darkened, damp patch on the armrest where the wet sleeve of Ifeanyi's jacket had rested. To an ordinary eye, it was a tiny spot of water that would dry in minutes, but Harrington stared at it as if it were a gaping wound. The moisture from this rag has seeped into the fibers, the salt from the rain, the dirt from the street. It has destroyed a piece of history. You've destroyed a piece of history because you couldn't keep your child under control." Chi gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No, sir. Please, I can clean it. I have special brushes. I know how to handle delicate fabrics." "You'll only make it worse," Harrington snapped, cutting her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "The damage is done. To reupholster this chair to its original state will cost at least $500. That's more than you make in a month, isn't it, Chi?" The room felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it. $500 was an impossible sum. It was the difference between their meager survival and the cold reality of the sidewalk. Chi's shoulders slumped, the weight of the lie crushing the last of her spirit. She looked at Ifeanyi, her eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of love and utter defeat. "I don't have it, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You know I don't have it." Harrington leaned in, placing his hands on the mahogany table, looming over them like a gargoyle. "Then we have a problem. I could take it out of your wages, but that would take months, and I don't keep people in my employ who are in debt to me. It creates a conflict of interest. It makes people desperate, and desperate people steal." He paused, letting the word steal hang in the air as he glanced meaningfully at the envelope of cash. He was watching Chi's eyes, waiting for her to look at the money, waiting for her to realize that the solution to all her problems was sitting just inches away. He wanted to see if she would suggest borrowing just a fraction of it, or if she would beg him to use the cash he clearly didn't need to cover the damage her son had caused. "Is that what you want, Chi?"
Harrington asked softly, his voice dripping with artificial silk. Ifeanyi looked from the damp spot on the chair to his mother's trembling form. He didn't understand the chemistry of velvet or the cost of French fabric, but he understood the look of a person who had lost all hope. He looked at his oversized white gloves, the fabric bunching at his small wrists, and then at the billionaire who seemed to have everything but appeared so incredibly angry. The boy's mind raced, searching for a way to bridge the gap between the $500 and the ruin of his mother's life. He didn't look at the envelope, he looked at his mother's heart, and he knew he had to find a way to pay the man back. The air in the library felt thin, as if the billionaire's heavy presence was consuming all the oxygen in the room. Chi remained on her knees, her head bowed, the silent tremors of her shoulders testifying to her total despair. $500 was an insurmountable wall, a debt that would bind them to Harrington's whims or cast them into the rain-soaked streets. Harrington looked down at the weeping woman and the trembling boy, his heart seemingly as hard as the diamonds he traded. Mercy is for those who earn trust, and in this house, trust is a currency you've clearly spent. He turned his back on them, walking toward the fireplace, leaving the mother and son in a state of absolute ruin. The monster had not just awakened, it had begun to tear their lives apart. And for Ifeanyi, the oversized gloves that were supposed to protect them now felt like a heavy shroud of failure. The air in the library felt thin, as if the billionaire's heavy presence was consuming all the oxygen in the room. Chi remained on her knees, her head bowed.
The silence that followed Ifeanyi's sacrifice was more profound than the storm outside. Mr. Harrington stared at the battered red car, its missing wheel and chipped paint a stark contrast to the gleaming mahogany and the cold, green paper of the money he had used as bait. He had expected to see a thief's hand. Instead, he was looking at the purest form of wealth he had ever encountered. The toy car sat on the table like a mirror, and for the first time in 40 years, Arthur Harrington didn't like the reflection looking back at him. His drumming fingers went still. The predatory sharpness in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a hollow, aching glassiness. He looked at Ifeanyi, a child who was shivering in a thin tank top because he had given away his only jacket, a child who was now giving away his only memory of his father just to keep his mother safe. Harrington's hand, usually so steady and commanding, reached out. His fingers trembled as they hovered over fast eddy. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't. He felt as though the small piece of metal was burning hot with a fire he had long ago extinguished in his own soul. "I have spent my life counting," Harrington began, his voice no longer a roar, but a raspy, broken whisper that seemed to come from a deep, dark well. "I counted every penny. I counted every betrayal. I built walls so high I thought no one could ever climb them." He looked up at Chi, who was still on her knees, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Then he looked at Ifeanyi. The billionaire's face, which had been a mask of stone for decades, suddenly cracked. A single tear escaped, tracing a slow, jagged path through the wrinkles on his cheek. "I called you a thief," Harrington choked out, the words catching in a throat tight with shame. "I called you a trespasser. But look at me. Look at this house." He gestured vaguely at the gold-leafed ceilings and the thousands of books he never read. "I have everything, and yet, standing here today, I realize I am a spiritual beggar. I am the one who is empty." He stood up, but he didn't tower over them this time. He seemed to shrink, his shoulders sagging under the invisible weight of his own bitterness. He walked around the table, his movements slow and heavy. He reached down, not to grab the boy in anger, but to pick up the damp, faded windbreaker from the floor. He shook it out with a tenderness that looked foreign on his hands. "I was cold, Ifeanyi," Harrington whispered, his voice trembling. "Not because of the draft from the window. I've been cold for a very long time. My heart was a block of ice, and I thought that was the only way to survive. I set a trap because I wanted you to be as ugly as I am. I wanted you to prove to me that goodness was a lie so I could keep being a monster in peace." He knelt down, a man whose net worth could buy cities, kneeling on a ruined velvet chair, to be at eye level with the 7-year-old. He held out the jacket. "I don't want your car, son," Harrington said, a sob finally breaking through his voice. "And there is no debt. There never was. The only person who owes anything in this room is me. I owe you an apology for forgetting what it means to be a human being." Chi let out a sob of her own, a sound of pure heart-stopping relief, and she pulled Ifeanyi into her arms. Harrington watched them, his chest heaving. He realized that the $5,000 in the envelope was just paper, but the warmth of the jacket Ifeanyi had placed on him was the first real thing he had felt in half a century. The billionaire, the master of the estate, sat on the edge of his expensive chair and wept, finally admitting to the shadows that he was no longer the hunter, but a man who had finally been found. The storm outside began to lose its fury, the violent drumming on the roof softening into a rhythmic, peaceful patter as the heavy tension in the library finally dissolved. Mr. Harrington remained on his knees for a long moment, the faded windbreaker clutched in his hands as if it were a holy relic. When he finally stood, he didn't return to the high-backed chair of his throne. Instead, he pulled a small wooden stool closer to Chi and Ifeanyi, sitting at their level, his movements humble and stripped of his usual billionaire bravado. He reached out and picked up Fast Eddie from the table. He held the broken car with a reverence usually reserved for his most expensive acquisitions. He looked at the missing wheel and the chipped med paint, then looked at Ifeanyi, who was now safely tucked back into his mother's side, but his dark eyes remained fixed on the old man with a curious, quiet wisdom. "You told me that love is the most expensive thing in the world," Harrington said, his voice regaining its strength but losing its edge. "I've spent 50 years dealing in things that have a price tag. I thought I was the master of value, but I was just a man who knew the cost of everything and the value of nothing." He looked at Chi, whose tears had dried, leaving her face glowing with a cautious newfound hope. "Chi, I promised to fire you today. I was looking for a reason to cast you out to satisfy my own hollow heart, but I cannot do that now. In fact, I can no longer ask you to be my maid." Chi's breath hitched, her fear momentarily resurfacing, but Harrington raised a hand to steady her. "I want to offer you a new position. I want you to manage this estate, not as a servant but as its keeper. I want this house to stop being a museum for a bitter man and start being a home again. And for Ifeanyi," the billionaire turned to the boy, a small, genuine smile twitching at the corners of his mouth, "I have a very special job for you, Ifeanyi. You see, I have a massive problem. I've forgotten how to be a human being. I've spent so long being a billionaire that I've turned into a stone. I want to hire you to be my teacher." Ifeanyi tilted his head, his brow furrowing in confusion. "But I'm just a kid. I don't know about business or money." "Exactly," Harrington replied, his eyes shimmering. "I don't need to know about money. I need to know how to see a cold man and want to cover him with my only jacket. I need to know how to value a broken toy more than $5,000. I will pay for your school, your books, and your future. In return, you will come here every weekend and you will teach me how to see the world through your eyes. We will fix Fast Eddie together, and maybe you can help me fix the things I've broken in myself." He reached into the envelope on the table, the $5,000 bait, and handed it to Chi. "This is not a test, and it is not a loan. This is back pay for the years I spent being a monster to the people who worked for me. Use it to find a proper home close to the estate. From today on, you are family."
Ifeanyi stepped forward and took his broken car back from Harrington's hand. He looked at the old man, then at the golden light of the fire reflecting in the billionaire's softened eyes. For the first time that afternoon, Ifeanyi took off the oversized white gloves. He reached out his bare, small hand and placed it over Harrington's wrinkled knuckles. "I can teach you," Ifeanyi said firmly. "It's not hard to be kind. You just have to listen to the heart thump." Harrington closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the boy's hand, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly rich. He had made many investments in his time, gold, tech, land, but as he looked at the mother and son he had tried to destroy, he knew that kindness was the only investment that never depreciated. The monster was gone, replaced by a man who was finally ready to learn his first lesson in human. 10 years had passed since the storm that changed the trajectory of the Harrington estate, and though the rain still fell against the library windows, the atmosphere inside was no longer heavy with suspicion. The room was warm, filled with the soft glow of amber lamps and the quiet, comforting scent of old paper and fresh tea. Mini Ifeanyi, now 17 years old, stood by the same mahogany table where a billionaire's cynical trap had once been set. He was taller now, his shoulders broad and his gaze steady, wearing a suit that fit him perfectly, a gift from a man who had become more than a mentor, but a grandfather in every sense that mattered. The library was quiet, but it was no longer lonely. Mr. Harrington had passed away peacefully only a week ago, leaving behind a legacy that had shifted from cold accumulation to radical generosity. In his final years, the master of the estate had become the city's greatest philanthropist, guided by the boy who had taught him that the heart's currency was the only one that didn't devalue. Mini Ifeanyi looked at the deep burgundy velvet chair. It was still there, but it was no longer a symbol of status or a prop for a deception. It was just a chair where an old man had spent his final afternoons laughing over Ifeanyi's school reports and cheese management of the Harrington Foundation.
Ifeanyi reached into his pocket. He pulled out Fast Eddie. The red paint was still chipped, and the windshield was still cracked, but the car was no longer broken. Years ago, as their first kindness lesson, Arthur and Ifeanyi had spent an entire afternoon in the workshop. They hadn't replaced the car, they had restored it. Where the missing wheel had once been, a custom-fitted wheel made of solid gold now sat, polished to a mirror shine. It was a reminder that when you fix something with love, it becomes more valuable than it was when it was new. Ifeanyi walked to the table and placed the car exactly where the envelope of cash had once sat. He positioned it carefully, the golden wheel catching the light of the fire. "Safe now," Ifeanyi whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It was the same promise he had made a decade ago when he secured the falling envelope, but the meaning had grown. He wasn't just keeping a job safe or keeping a billionaire warm. He was honoring a promise to keep a legacy of kindness alive. Under Ifeanyi's inheritance, the Harrington fortune would no longer be a wall used to keep the world out. It would be a bridge. As he turned to leave the room, his mother, UCHE, appeared in the doorway. She wasn't carrying a cleaning rag or wearing a look of terror. She wore the poise of a woman who had helped rebuild an empire on a foundation of grace. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes drifting to the toy car on the table. "He would be proud, Ifeanyi," she said softly. "He taught me how to lead," Ifeanyi replied, looking back at the empty chair one last time. "But he always said I was the one who taught him how to live." Ifeanyi walked out of the library, leaving Fast Eddie as the permanent guardian of the room. He stepped out into the world, not just as the heir to a billionaire's estate, but as a young man who knew that the greatest fortune a person can leave behind isn't found in a bank vault, but in the hearts of those they dared to trust. The cycle of bitterness had been broken, replaced by a golden thread of compassion that would stretch far beyond the walls of the Harrington mansion.
Firstly, I want to shout out to Dee Lawson. We love you. Thank you for the constant love and support on this channel. Every like, share, comment, and subscription truly means everything to me and helps this community keep growing. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be giving personal shout-outs and thanking you directly in my next post. I appreciate every single one of you.